I'm going to be introducing our next speaker now, who is Jen Earl, who's going to be presenting the future of social movement organizations, the waning dominance of SMOs online. Jen?
Yeah. So I'm not going to speak from behind the podium because there's a height perspective issue. I think you guys would not find me. So thanks so much for all the work that you've put in, Daraj and Alex and the AV folks and everyone at Special Events for your campus. It's really nice of you to put this together. It's my first time out to Maine, so I'm super excited to be here, and I know it was a lot of work, so know that there's a lot of appreciation. So today I want to spend my time talking about a larger debate that's happening in the social movements literature about the continuing necessity or relevance of social movement organizations, or what for ease I'll abbreviate like other social movement scholars as SMOs today, how necessary they are to creating and maintaining protest. So I'm going to start off by sort of outlining what the classic position in the literature has been. And the dominant view for over 3 decades has really been that social movement organizations are critical to the creation and maintenance of protest and larger protest movements. So, think about the 3 organizations represented by the logos here. You really couldn't tell a defensible story about civil rights without thinking about the NAACP. You couldn't tell a defensible story about the second wave of feminist organizing without reference to NOW. You couldn't tell a defensible story about the American labor movement without thinking about AFL-CIO. And, so in a very lived way, SMOs are kind of what we think about as anchoring social movements. And more broadly, they've really been at the center of social movement scholarship for over 3 decades since the development of resource mobilization as a school of thought. So, they actually had, it's funny to think about the development of social movement organizations in the literature because they really kind of started with a humble beginning, which was John McCarthy and Meir Zald who formalized resource mobilization, drew on Olson's work on public goods. And Olson argued, as we all know, that it wasn't always rational for people to participate in the creation of public goods because you could enjoy the benefits of those goods without actually having participated in producing them. People could free ride. And what John and Meir did was take that insight and apply it to social movements and say essentially that it wasn't always rational for people to participate in a social movement because they could enjoy the benefits of that movement without having contributed to its success. And so social movement organizations were really brought into resource mobilization as a way of thinking about how you resolve that free rider dilemma. So they collect resources, they strategically distribute them, creating selective incentives. So really, their theoretical origin was as resource bundlers and spenders. But this sort of humble beginning has produced over, like I said, 3 decades of very hearty scholarship on the importance of social movement organizations. So what I want to do in the next couple minutes is talk through maybe some of the things that we've learned about social movement organizations over those 3 decades in terms of thinking about other things that social movement organizations may provide to social movements. So one of the things that they importantly provide is a way to institutionalize a movement. So I'm thinking here about work by Suzanne Stagenborg, for instance, who's persuasively shown that more formal SMOs actually increase the longevity of movements overall. I'm thinking about other people's work like John McCarthy's on Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who have argued that even when movements are started by movement entrepreneurs, that those same entrepreneurs benefit the movement by allowing it to formalize into social movements. And other folks have argued that they're also helpful to in that institutionalization process because they help movements get through dark periods. So, for instance, Verda Taylor has referred to this as the movement doldrums or periods of very low mobilization, and she's argued that SMOs serve a function as an abeyance provider, an abeyance structure, where personnel, skills, interest can be nourished through dark times in movements. So, aside from just this resource bundling function, SMOs help to actually create some longevity and stability in movements. Other folks have argued that SMOs are really important to providing leadership and strategy. So let's think about the civil rights movement for a second as a classic example. Try to imagine what the civil rights movement would have been like without the strategic thinking of SNCC, without the strategic thinking of COFO, without the strategic thinking of CORE. You know, we wouldn't have had things like Freedom Summer come about. We wouldn't have had freedom rides. These were really big picture strategic leadership projects that social movement organizations helped to produce. Social movement organizations also actually produce most of the events that people actually participate in offline. So whether you're thinking about a March on Washington, a global day of protest, or some other kind of staged protest events, largely social movement organizations have traditionally been the central organizers of those events. They've also been shown to be important to, for instance, coming up with new tactics and then diffusing those, so some classic research on the diffusion of sit-ins, for instance, and also in mobilizing people to participate in events that even other organizations sponsor. So here I'm thinking about classic work on mesomobilization, or how organizations help to organize other organizations and therefore their participants. SMOs have also been thought of as the central player in gaining media coverage for social movements. So while it's certainly the case that SMOs vary in how good of a job they do at performing this role, it is nonetheless the case that most research on media and social movements assumes that this is really being driven by social movement organizations. And finally, SMOs have been argued to help support the creation of collective identity, which many people have argued is in itself important for the creation and maintenance of collective action. So SMOs obviously help to bring like-minded people together. They can also support the development of nascent social movement communities. And some research has found that people more easily attach to social movement organizations than they do a larger community. And for those people, this is a sort of way into collective identity. So taken together, the list of sort of roles, or what I'm going to refer to as returns on investment in social movement organizations, are pretty impressive. And this helps us to understand why, for several decades, people have assumed that you really can't study social movements without studying social movement organizations. They're part and parcel. Methodologically, they're actually how we often go about selecting cases and studying social movements. Now, the thing about this is that online, we can find lots of empirical examples where people are engaged in organizing and in actively participating in social movements outside of these organizations. And I want to suggest that in particular, there's research showing that whole movements can be organized without SMOs. So I'm thinking about work by Alan Shushman and I on the strategic voting movement, by Laura Gorek on a host of different online campaigns, people who have studied DCSS, people who have studied digital rights, although that's a bit more complicated of a case because of the role of EFF. And other EFF-like groups. But there's a lot of good empirical evidence that despite what expectations that 30 years of literature would have brought about the real centrality of SMOs, this is happening. And it's also happening in terms of people participating outside of SMOs. So Katrina Kimport, in a book that I'm going to talk about briefly in a minute, show that lots of people are creating their own actions online, participating in actions that have been created by others online outside of social movement organizations. And so whether we think about this thing as something that social movement scholars would expect to happen or not, it is the case that it is in fact happening. And so the question then becomes, how do we account for this and how do we understand it within a literature that's really anchored to thinking about social movement organizations as a key and sort of foundational concern in the literature and an entity in the real world. Katrina Kimport and I have argued in our book, Digitally Enabled Social Change, that one of the ways that we can think about explaining this is to focus on how people leverage unique affordances of the web. And we use affordances a little bit differently than it sounds like you guys do, not whole cloth differently, but just a little bit differently, which is we think about affordances as what a technology differently enables versus a competitor technology. And one of the things that I think is special about thinking about affordances and the web is that a lot of times when you read like HCI work on affordances, or you read early psychological perceptions work on affordances, they're talking about simple technologies like a refrigerator affords cooling, you know, a door affords opening, although I think the more important affordance of a door is locking, because you know, tons of things actually afford passage, but very few afford the ability to prevent it. But these are pretty simple technologies. It's not hard to figure out what a fridge is designed to do. And indeed, the idea of thinking about affordances for HCI is that you should build technologies where it's not hard for people to figure out what they should do. The web is a altogether far more complex technology. And so Katrina and I argue that it's often difficult to figure out what the unique capacities of a technology that's as complex as the web are. But we point to two that we think are pretty important for social movement scholarship. The ability to drastically reduce the costs of organizing and participating, and the ability to allow coordination without co-presence in time and space. So two things that obviously everyone here is familiar with, but not all of my colleagues in social movements studies spend a lot of time thinking about. And we argue that when people well leverage these technologies, which they may fail to do for a variety of reasons, including they choose not to, for ideological reasons. I could give you some examples of that in Q&A if people are interested. They don't recognize the capacities, they don't have the technical skills to use them. Whatever that whole host of reasons are, we argue if you are able to really leverage these two affordances, then you can powerfully enable action outside of social movement organizations. Now, I do want to give a caveat, and this is the same caveat that Katrina and I would give in our book, which is we're really focused on ways that people are organizing or participating online. Now, in a few minutes, I'll talk about how you could make this applicable to thinking about offline protest and protests that mix online and offline forms. But what's sort of special about online organizing and online participation from Katrina and I's perspective is that it does allow you to more fully leverage these affordances. And so there's a theoretical distinction about how low you can drop those costs and how easily you can coordinate that is relevant to thinking about the role of SMOs. So for now, I want to sort of focus us on a simpler question than the offline-online debate will focus us on, which is if we're discussing online protest and those cost and co-presence affordances are well leveraged, do the returns on social movement organizations, does that return on investment apply that we've been seeing before? And my argument, and Katrina and I's argument over time, has basically been no. And I want to walk you through why we think that's the case, or why I guess I don't want to speak for Katrina. Maybe she's watching, cursing me or something. First, as I sort of hinted to before, online protests can be very, very cheap to create and participate in. Now, you can think of offline protests as having more and less expensive forms of action. But I want to argue that none of those even less expensive actions are as dramatically less expensive as online organizing is. So I can animate this with an example. There's a website now bought by change.org that used to exist independently. And basically, this guy decided, you know, I think petitioning is a good idea for democracy. And so I happen to have a server. I'm going to put up some software where basically people can put in any kind of petition they want. And so long as it's not about something illegal, I'll host it and host the signatures. And over time, Petition Online collected tens of millions of signatures for hundreds of thousands of petitions. This is not something that you or I could decide to do out in the quad. We couldn't just say, you know, we've got enough copiers, we have enough paper, we have enough signature gatherers, we'll get a ton of students and we'll go out and do this. No, very quickly you see for even a low-cost form of offline action, there are real resource requirements that are not as tangible for this kind of online engagement. So what we're arguing is that basically the cost of building and maintaining social movement organizations can actually be larger than the return on investment you're getting for online participation and online organizing. And this is similar to what Alan Shishman and I found in our study of the strategic voting movement, and it's a sort of specific case of the more general argument that Clay Shirky has made on the declining return on investment to organizations because of the ease of collaboration online. Now, some researchers would go even a little bit farther on this particular issue. So Bimber and his colleagues, for instance, have argued that the free rider dilemma is actually a special case of a much larger issue about crossing public and private divides. And they argue that basically the costs of sharing online are so low that the free rider dilemma doesn't really pertain to online activity. So a second reason that we thought that social movement organizations may matter is that they help to institutionalize movements. But I want to argue that online organizing and participation can actually offer an alternative model of power that really reduces the need to institutionalize movements. So a traditional model of movement power has seen power as emanating from the continual participation of people across time. But flash activism has really sees power as emanating from the incredible onslaught of participation that can be generated online, even if that participation is ephemeral. So flash activism is really likening its power to that of a flash flood, where it's the volume, not the consistency of power that matters. And just by way of example, to put it bluntly, if you were a House of Representatives member and you got 10,000 emails within the span of a week from your constituents on a topic, it really shouldn't matter to you that much that it's an ephemeral way for them to engage. Or to put it differently, you're not doing yourself a good service by ignoring those 10,000 emails and saying, oh, but it's so easy to email. Still, 10,000 of your constituents have done something to tell you how they feel. And that's the flash flood model, that it's not the consistency of that activity, but rather the size of it that matters. Now, so I would argue that this idea that we need to even institutionalize action to achieve results in some circumstances is not necessary. And I would also argue that abeyance structures may be less necessary in some circumstances. So you can literally, for instance, save your movement website to a flash drive and wait until the next time something like this comes up and then plug it in, and your tactics, your repertoires are all ready to go. So what I've found in my work is that you can find a lot of episodic movements over time. So as opposed to the kind of doldrums that Verda Taylor talked about, where movements were still there but in really low mobilization, you can really see things pretty much go away. And if you interview the actors who are involved in them, they're not working on them. But the next time that issue comes back around, they're ready to mobilize quite easily. So you don't need these kinds of abeyance structures. I would also argue that it's possible to lead protests without the effort of social movement organizations. So I want to point to here what I think people would only incorrectly understand as a social movement organization, which is Anonymous. So Anonymous has been incredibly effective at organizing online and offline events without what we would, as social movement scholars, think of as real traditional organizational infrastructure, and they demonstrate the power for distributed leadership. Elsewhere, I've argued that more generally we could think about the difference between leadership and leadership tasks, and that often leadership tasks can actually be completed in a distributed way online, allowing people to make important strategic decisions, accomplish important leadership tasks, but without the kind of charismatic leadership or organizational leadership that we've traditionally seen that be involved in. Katrina Kimport and I, in our book, Digitally Enabled Social Chains, also showed that in terms of being protest event organizers, websites organized by social movement organizations were no more likely to offer online forms of engagement than those that weren't. Put it differently, there was no relative advantage or return on investment to offering protest actions online if you were a website created by a social movement organization or not. Now, I will talk in a few minutes about a caveat to this finding, which is we did find that social movement organizations, their websites were more likely to sponsor and support offline protest. But we argue that's because that's a more expensive kind, where you get some return on your investment, where the costs of supporting that social movement organization are now less than what you're getting out of it in return. Okay, so another rationale that people have given for investing in social movement infrastructure has been that SMOs increase the odds of media coverage. But I think we can kind of recognize that in a media environment where traditional outlets are really pressured to try to seem relevant or in touch, there's a lot of pressure for them to cover what's happening online and in social media. And so it may be possible to get significant crossover coverage in the mainstream media without having the traditional infrastructure and social movement organizations of press offices, press representatives, etc. More generally, the internet allows the ability for organizers and participants to speak directly to publics, sort of cutting out the press as an intermediary and making this kind of representation through the press slightly less necessary. Finally, people have argued that we should invest in social movement infrastructure because they build collective identity. I want to make two related points here. The first is, that's fine, because you can build collective identity online. So I'm drawing here on examples like work that I've done on the We Are the 99% Tumblr page and how that creates identity. What is an Occupy participant, both for insiders and for the press, as well as thinking about the work of others who have looked at online collective identity in various kinds of virtual communities. I want to also argue, though, that it may be the case that collective identity is less important in some kinds of online engagement. That is, while you can build it online, you don't necessarily need it. So to sign that petition, I don't necessarily have to feel the same level of affiliation and connection to that cause as I would if I were going to drive 4 hours to a Capitol, spend the day protesting, risk getting arrested, drive back home, and have that kind of investment. So, what I'm trying to argue across looking at these sort of 6 different reasons that you would want to invest in SMOs and evaluate the necessity of that for online activism is basically to argue that contrary to what we've, as social movement scholars, have come to believe over the last 3 decades, that SMOs are really not now a prerequisite for online organizing or protest. They may be helpful in certain ways, and I'm going to discuss that a bit more now, but they're no longer prerequisites. And so this sort of dominance of social movement organizations in our theorizing may need to be questioned. Now, having said that, I don't want to argue that that means that SMOs are going away. The argument that Katrina and I have made in the literature and that I've made about organizations, some people like sort of Dave Karp have written about this and said, well, wait, SMOs are actually really, really important and they're not going anywhere. Bruce Bimber, Andrew Flanagan, and Cynthia Stoll's recent book argues, hey, look, social movement organizations and other kind of voluntary organizations are thriving in the internet age. They're not going anywhere. I actually don't see these arguments as in tension, because what Dave Karp is looking at is usually offline forms of organizing. You want to turn people out into the street. And what Bruce and Cynthia and Andrew are looking at are also voluntary organizations where you have lots of offline engagement that's happening as well. And Katrina and I look at this and we say, okay, those are more expensive kinds of engagement that require more coordination costs. And so we would expect that that would happen inside of organizations and that the kind of less expensive and easier to coordinate things that we're studying are going to happen outside of organizations. So as a preliminary, I don't see these arguments as actually in as much tension as other authors may see them as being. But I would argue that even if they were, that doesn't mean that SMOs would go away. So even if my argument's right, that there's not always a very strong return on investment, I don't think that that means that SMOs will go away. And I want to talk about why that might be for a few minutes. First, there are situations where social movement organizations still do provide sound returns on investment. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, if you want to organize an offline protest event, a social movement organization is still a really good vehicle for doing that. And plenty of people want to do this, and so it would be silly for social movement organizations to go away. There are lots of movements that are interested in long-haul concerns. So while it's completely possible to impact a zoning restriction, a law that's going to, the passage of a specific law where there's a vote on a specific day, those are great things for flash activism to deal with. Probably racism is not going to be ended by flash activism. And so I think instead of having this idea that all kinds of activism have to address all issues, we might do a better job to think about flash activism as more appropriate for some kinds of goals, whereas enduring social movement organizations and movements are more appropriate for other kinds of goals. Other people would argue, hey, there's still some role for having a stable network of players who are involved. So in instances, for instance, where you have two really opposing sides that don't trust each other, stable actors can sort of mediate that over time as they build trust. But even here, I think that Andrew Chadwick and Bennett have argued that these kinds of networks may be able to be supported outside of social movement organizations. So I kind of add this one in as some trepidation. It is an area where people still argue that social movements will matter, even though there's some evidence that we could do this through networks as opposed to organizations. Now, while I think that these three scenarios for the continuing presence and contribution of SMOs serve as a starting place, I actually think we need to go further into understanding why SMOs continue to thrive today. So I guess we have a sort of ironic conclusion, which is, although I think that social movement organizations are no longer prerequisites for the kind of organizing I study, I still think we need more research on why they're around and thriving. And I want to suggest a few places that we could start in thinking about that. First one is convenience. So I started thinking about this when I was working on my income taxes, because you know, it's a time where you have to look at what your charitable giving was, and I realized that although I'm someone who in my academic life talks about the declining role of social movement organizations, that doesn't stop me from donating on a regular basis to large, well-known social movement organizations that you would all be familiar with. And so I started thinking about, well, why do I do this? You know, and for me, it's a very convenient way of supporting that movement activity and making sure it continues. I don't have to spend my time figuring out what I should support individually. I can sort of pay someone else to do that job for me. Another alternative that I think Dave Karp would probably champion is that if you're concerned about popularity, you might really be concerned with investing in social movement organizations. So Dave really sees the web as being a sort of a vast land, I don't want to say wasteland, he might get mad at me for that, but a vast land of really unpopular sites that no one ever goes to, with a sort of few mountainous peaks that are really important. And in his mind, it's those mountainous peaks that matter, and the rest is just sort of noise. Now, I don't agree with that position, but if you did agree with that position, if you thought that popularity or brand was really important, so that you believed that popular change makers were the most important change makers, then social movement organizations should continue to be really important to you, because they help manage that brand, they help keep that brand popular, they help keep it visible in a way that may be more difficult to do without them. I also want to argue that there's a question that nobody has asked yet that we really need to ask, which is whether or not SMOs contribute to an overall movement ecology that is benefited by having at least some SMOs in it, even if the sort of percent SMOs as actors declines over time. So we really only have a very few studies on what movements look like when they're SMO free. We have tons of examples when they're mostly SMOs, but really very few examples to use to theorize about what it means to be an SMO-free ecology. And my suspicion is that ecologies that have a mixture of actors, some social movement organizations and some not, are probably healthier and more vigorous ecologies than those that are dominated only by organizations or only by non-organizational action. And so I'm sort of hoping that, that we could collectively look at these kinds of possibilities. What are the returns on investment that social movement organizations are making? And probably if we started looking at that, find others. So to conclude, my talk today has been meant to summarize evolving arguments about the role and necessity of SMOs in online organizing. I hope that I've convinced you that there's some substantial empirical reason to believe that SMOs, despite all expectations, are not prerequisites for online protests today. Although that said, that doesn't imply that they're necessarily going to go away. And so I hope I've also, piqued your interest in some research directions that the field could go in that might help us figure out how can you maintain that dual finding that they're no longer prerequisites, that there's less return on investment, and yet they're probably not going anywhere. And what's that about? Thanks.
Definitely have some time for questions. Questions for Earl? Nicole?
So I would love to hear your thoughts on this notion of slacktivism, the idea that signing an online petition is so cheap, but it doesn't really have the same effect as a putting your body right in a physical protest, and that the problem then is that people engage in these online activities and kind of feel like they've done something and then fail to do what they might have otherwise done. So it's actually kind of a net effect of a negative net effect.
So I am a big defender of slacktivism. And I think actually social movement scholars in general should be, because it taps into some of our most basic understanding of social movements. So the first thing that you have to know when you're a social movement scholar is that most people don't do anything. That is the whole concern of social movement scholarship, is how do you explain the couple people who actually did something versus all the people who knew about it and did nothing, and all the people who never cared to know in the first place. And so we have this huge theoretical and empirical machinery designed to basically deal with the fact that most people don't do crap. And so I think a lot of people sort of start with the slacktivist question with an assumption that social movement scholarship roundly would say is wrong, which is that most people were going to do something. So this sort of idea that you've substituted out some more vigorous engagement for some lower cost engagement and called it a day just isn't empirically supportable. What was actually probably going to happen is you were going to do nothing. And online activism gave you a format in which you could at least do something. And it may not have been the something that a social movement organizer would wish that you would do, but that's their life, that they're wishing people would do a lot of things that they regularly don't do. So I think we could have social movement organizations would benefit a lot, actually, by instead of thinking about this as a glass half empty kind of thing, as thinking about it as a glass half full kind of thing, which is you now have a technology that will allow you to get more people to do something for your cause than they would have been willing to do if you were asking them to do something more expensive. So let's take the Coney 2012 example. A lot of people complain about this, and including in social movement scholarship. Oh, they didn't do anything. They were okay. Do you really think that the Obama administration has the same position now as before that video went viral about their commitment to doing something about Africa? And when has the United States ever been known as a country that was deeply concerned, even for a minute, about what was happening in Africa. And can you tell me a social movement organization that no matter what people go on to do after that, wouldn't happily accept 100 million people thinking about their issue for 5 or 10 minutes? And so I think this sort of idea that, Coney 2012 is a bust because it wasn't completely accurate, because blah, blah, people weren't asked to do that much. I think actually if we think about really what social movement organization would turn that down if they had that capacity. And it probably did actually have some real impacts, even though people didn't do a lot of things. And that's the idea of flash activism, that if you get 100 people to do something really expensive, it may actually not matter as much as if you get 100,000 people to do something really cheap. I want to think about this in a second way as well, which is to think about how little we know about what targets think about tactics. So I think a starting assumption of the idea that slacktivism is a waste from an effects, so you were sort of, the first way you could take that is from you're wasting people as a resource, they could do more. The second way you could think about it is it's just not very effective. Actually, we don't know a ton of, the sort of dirty little secret of social movement studies is we don't know a lot about what makes movements effective, and we know even less about what makes particular campaigns or tactics effective. So let's play with this sort of mentally and see, okay, given what we know empirically is true, let's come up with some hypotheses that would have to be true if we thought that slacktivism didn't matter. So a sort of fundamental proposition in that is that a target of a tactic is going to rate their response based upon how expensive it was to engage in. That would make self-immolation one of the most effective tactics in the world. Because really, burning yourself, there's not much of a bigger way to say I'm invested in this. It is in fact not one of the most effective tactics in the world. And in the Middle East, where examples of self-immolation helped to kick off the Arab Spring, it wasn't because targets took them seriously. It was because other people in the country took them seriously. So when you start breaking down the assumptions, well, did targets really think that way? No, targets are probably mostly worried about what damage can you cause them. And 100,000 people, even peripherally, can cause a lot more damage than 100 people in a more invested way. And so I think if we were to start researching more intensively what are those assumptions that we make about the effectiveness of slacktivism, we'd realize actually a lot of those aren't probably going to hold up. And we would also find that there are tons of examples of these kinds of campaigns having very real effects, whether it's in terms of policy or in terms of cultural issues. And I'd be happy to give a number of them. The last thing I would say on this is it always assumes that offline activism is effective. And we just can't show that. And so there's this sort of starting, people assume that the bars are like this, but really the bars are probably somewhere more like that. And we're just kind of keeping it a dirty little secret that actually it's really kind of hard to prove that it was women's participation in the feminist movement versus white women's increased labor market participation versus white women's higher level of, well, all women's higher level of higher education that actually produced the kinds of outcomes we see. That's actually really hard to do. And so the sort of last thing I would say about that is all of this assumes that offline organizing is effective in some way that we actually don't know whether or not it is.
I really, really enjoyed this talk. Terrific listening
Thanks.
to all this and trying to write in. I love that you're giving so many citations. I try to write down as many as I could, but maybe I'll get more from you after.
We're going to have to tweet them up as well.
Right, yeah, there's
A
some
lot of
really
different
great citations.
Okay.
So I'm really curious. I like how you pulled apart flash activism versus more enduring activism and how they often are useful for different things, have different goals.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how much, if you could speak to how much they collude with each other and help each other out, and other times how they butt up against each other and maybe displace each other. One of the things with flash activism, or maybe you wanting your movement to go viral, right? I think Occupy did a lot of that work on social media, try to make the movement go viral. one of the things we know about memes or something that goes viral is that we quickly get tired of them. And so sometimes virality might actually preclude longevity in different ways. So, could a movement actually kind of get in trouble with trying to be really viral because that might hurt the longevity of the attention and popularity? That's just one of the tensions I think there might be between flash and enduring activism. That's a very half-baked idea. I was curious your thoughts about it.
I guess I would sort of distinguish between what are actual sort of intrinsic tensions, or maybe I wouldn't go so far as intrinsic, but fairly deep-rooted tensions, and then what tensions may be sort of more culturally derived that we could probably get around. So, and I would actually say that I think about most of those tensions as being more culturally derived. So, and let me give you sort of, my colleagues in social movement studies don't like the idea of flash activism very much. And if you spent your last 30 years studying social movement organizations and studying social movements because you were inspired by the civil rights movement, by the feminist movement, and then you see people doing things online, there's a way in which you kind of feel like that's a slap in the face for all of the work that people did in my generation. And I think if you're an activist now and you are bearing the very significant biographical consequences of being an activist, it's one of the areas that we actually can show effects, but they're negative. You're bearing those very significant biographical effects of being an activist. You're a little pissed at the idea that people would call themselves activists who are not bearing those same obligations. And so I think actually a lot of the animosity towards flash activism comes from social movement activists who are sort of long-term, deeply committed activists, and from social movement scholars, both of whom have this sort of cultural model of what activism is. And I think actually if we could sort of find a way to just talk everyone down for a minute and say, okay, what if instead of being angry that somebody was doing something for your cause, which is actually kind of what you want people to do, what if you thought about how, okay, if you had to accept that this is all people were willing to do, that that is at any given moment immutable. Maybe not over the long time, but at any given moment, this is their cap on what they're willing to do. How could your organization or your movement start to more effectively organize if it actually tried to figure out how do we productively use that? So how do we productively figure out what simple thing 10,000 people could do for us this year at one moment versus being pissed that those people would call themselves activists? So I actually think a ton of this is cultural, and it actually goes both ways. It's interesting, when I interview people who have apparently activist websites, I'll ask them about whether they're activists, and no, activists are people who dedicate sure, I'm hosting petitions and a letter writing campaign and I'm organizing for change, but I'm not an activist. So people, sort of by and large buy into this definition both ways, and I think a lot of that is actual cultural tension, not necessary tension.
But if the logic is always you try to get as many people as possible to join in on your cause, and I think a lot of people start with that logic. It's always good to have more attention.
Mm-hmm.
That rejects the idea that there's attention fatigue, right? That something can be over. Think of the Portlandia sketch over when something becomes very popular and say everybody's tweeting about Occupy, and then we kind of go, well, these aren't really activists, and they're all tweeting about Occupy, and then people might get tired of Occupy. There might be fatigue in all this attention.
Yeah, so I think that there is probably a real trade-off between size and longevity, because if it's hard to get people to do anything, it's really hard to get them to do something more and to keep doing it. And so I do think that there's this tension. At the same time, I don't think that that's necessarily a problem, because you weren't getting most of those people to do anything. And so that you had something to be over is a huge success for a lot of movements. And there are probably, some people for whom it's not over for, and that they got some boost of activity is probably pretty meaningful. And particularly meaningful for third parties that you're worried about, because it may be over in terms of what's happening on Twitter. It's probably not over in the mind of news media writers who are figuring out what should I write about. It's probably not over for government representatives who are like, we don't want that blow up again. And so I think that there is probably this trade-off, but I think what I would say is sort of cultural about that is thinking that that's a problem.
Sorry, I'm going to bring in a quick question from Twitter, PJ, and then I go to, this is from @StopTheCyborgs, and he says self-immolation, or she, I don't actually know this Twitter user. Do you know if it's a he or she? Nathan? Okay.
Is that person here?
No, one of the Twitter. Anyway, so Stop the Cyborg says self-immolation is a bit of a strawman example compared with strikes, with a secondary tweet of other than denial of service attacks. It's hard to think of what online-only direct action would look like.
So, I mean, I would just say that really the dirty secret of social movement scholarship is you can't assume that all of those things matter, that they're effective. And so this idea that we have this thing that always works and now we're choosing a cheap knockoff, that just isn't what we know. And it certainly, people feel strongly about it. People may feel more committed to a movement. They may make more lifestyle changes, all these other kinds of things. But in terms of changing that target, not always. And so I think self-immolation is a helpful example in that it focuses us on what's the real nugget of that argument, that it's cost. But I think you could look at other kinds, hunger strikes. Guantanamo Bay is what, in its second month of hunger strikes? Do we think that that's going to do anything? So I don't think that the evidence is in the court of all of those tactics mattering because of how costly they are.
Which is that, social movement organizers don't like slacktivism not because they have a cultural assumption about what activism looks like, but because they feel threatened by it, because their own identity and the thing they value most is not the ends of the movement itself, but their own sense of self-importance because of the role that they feel they play in the movement, and that they're feeling marginalized, sidelined, or that they're sort of authority is threatened by those things, and that's more of an authority issue or a legitimacy issue for them and their personal identity, as opposed to this violation of just some cultural assumption.
I'm glad you said that, not me.
Well, I don't have much to lose. This isn't my field.
I mean, I would bet that if we did a study, we would find that there's some mixtures of motivations there. Probably some of what you said and probably some of what I said. And I think that for me, what I spend more time thinking about is how could you convince someone that it's in their interest to take this more seriously? So how do you get a social movement organization to stop thinking about, so a lot of social movement organizations, when you talk to them about their web engagement, they really have this sort of gateway drug, like online activism is the marijuana of activism. That you sort of get people in with the small stuff, and then they get addicted to it and get into the big stuff. And so there's this sort of model that your website isn't effective unless you have this ladder of engagement that you're constantly getting people to climb up. And that online activism is this easy, low first rung, and once you get people onto the ladder, then your website's job is to get them to keep climbing up. And I think for me, what I spend more time thinking about is how could I get an organization to think about it being in their interest to set that ladder aside and to say, what if you couldn't have a ladder? What if I could tell you that research shows that across time, there's going to be such significant drop-off that that ladder isn't a good investment for you, and instead got you to think about what could 10,000 people that you could get to do something about, do something small this week, what could they do for you if you just got rid of that idea of the ladder? And that's, I think organizations are coming around to it, but I think it's a slow haul to get them to sort of get off the gateway drug thinking.
Related to that, would there potentially be some value? I really love the idea of the social movement ecology, because there may be a functional aspect to the flash activism being separate from the organization. So, and I think that Nathan's comment about the time angle of it, I think, popped into my mind, because when an individual asks me to sign a petition, like a friend that gets some sort of comment, not from an organization, or they want me to donate to support something, a race or a cause, and it's just that one-time thing. Like it seems low effort, just doing this one thing there. But from an organizational standpoint, if your comment is, if they want to support that flash thing, but they don't want to do it just once, they want to do it again and again. So I think of political things, and I got involved and donated once, or said I'd do something once, and then they sent me emails again and again because they had that model there. And as an organization, you do want to support people who would continue to engage, but you also don't want to then alienate people who, and so there's maybe value in having that one-time thing, different functions, but if the same organization was trying to do the one-time thing and trying to do the continual thing, then there may be that tension. So, how does kind of the time aspect, so we want to do a flash thing, but we want to keep doing flash things, and that's a difficult thing to do.
So, the organizations that are able to do that tend to have such a large membership base that they're basically mobilizing very small segments of their user base at any given time. So think about Move On. Why Move On can generate 10,000 signatures often is that they have a really large base. And so you only have to activate a very small percentage of your base. And as long as that's going to change, let's even assume that it's random. As long as it changes, you're going to be able to get lots of activation. So I don't think that an organization can't do it. It just would need to have a base that's large enough to support that. The other thing I would say, just sort of bringing these 2 points together, is that one of the things that's hard to get organizations focused on about thinking about online activism is, for them, the sort of gateway for the organization to do online activism was often a sales pitch about how it would affect your charitable receipts. And so there are a lot of for-profit companies that basically sell. There's sort of 5 or 6 big. There's been some mergers, so the numbers have changed. But there's a handful of large companies that are for-profit that basically go to non-for-profits and say, hey, let us run your web presence. And why would you want to pay us for that? Well, because we can make your fundraising operation so much more efficient, because we can tell you, based on what people do on your website, how likely they are to donate to you. And so you can use that petition activity, for instance, to much better target your direct mail campaign. And it turns out that actually a lot of early engagement for SMOs online was not actually that they really cared whether you signed the petition. It was that they cared that they knew something more about you that would help them save money and therefore make more money on fundraising. And so, it's kind of hard to get organizations that came into it for a very different motive to think about, let's think about this as actually being something real, tangible, potentially effective under the right circumstances, and how do we convert that into our organizational strategy, when honestly some of those organizations were just offering, it was like the, Teens Week poll on the side of, do you think that Justin Bieber's cute? It wasn't real engagement in some way. It was like a way to get you to get some membership data on you so that they could focus their marketing. And so moving organizations away from that into thinking about this as a sort of realistic and potentially effective strategy is, it's a heavy lift, but it's happening.
Thank you. We're going to have to end with that because of time. We sort of, if Justin Bieber is too old or